Howdy, everybody. So today we're going to be talking about the Great Depression and a little bit of the New Deal, kind of a quick overview of some of the big New Deal programs. So let's dive in. So we got to remember the 1920s, the decade before the beginning of the Great Depression, was this kind of Jekyll and Hyde situation. On one end, you have these cities and this extravagant lifestyle, the Great Gatsby-esque kind of worldview. But on the other, you have this rural life that feels often left behind, abandoned by the cities and the technological and innovation centers. While they get to enjoy all the new amenities and the benefits of modern life, the people on the farms are feeling left behind, dejected, abandoned. Now, in the election of 1928, you have Herbert Hoover running for president, and then you have his Democratic opponent, Alfred Smith. Now, Smith is interesting because he's the first Catholic nominated by a major party. Now, today Catholicism is pretty ubiquitous with the United States, but at this point in time, the Protestant version of Christianity dominated, and Catholics were seen as kowtowing to the Pope. So they were worried, many Americans were worried that they would be showing more a Catholic president might show more allegiance to the Pope in Rome than to the American people. Not really the case ever, but that was the fear. However, it wouldn't be until JFK that we had our first Catholic president. Nonetheless, Hoover wins by an astronomical margin. So this is a big change. Even the solid South doesn't go so solid this time. So Hoover is elected with a massive landslide. But almost immediately after Hoover takes over, Hoover was supposed to be the president during this optimistic time of continual growth, but something with the stock market is going to happen. A lot of speculation, a lot of inflation, a lot of different factors contributed to the stock market crashing. To kind of give you an idea that stocks began to tumble in price, the Radio Corporation of America, before prices dropped, they had this massive and rapid inflation of the prices. So you have the Radio Corporation of America shot up from $85 a share to $420 a share within 1 year. So this is astronomical inflation. And it wasn't about the real value of the company. It was speculation, people thinking, oh, if I invest money in the stock market, there's only one way to go. It only goes up. But things can only go up at these high rates for so long before they begin to fall. Now, with the crash in 1929, it's going to have two major effects. First, it's going to kill the banks. Without banks, you can't give loans. Without loans, companies can't stay afloat, can't pay their employees. Banks start calling in the debt from a lot of these loans, and the whole society begins to crumble because we're a society based, most capitalist societies are based on debt, on credit, on loans. So you have a lot of people left without work. And this is going to be a problem. So the first big issue is the banks collapsed, and the second is the banks took the economy down with it. So you have this kind of slow collapse at first. So in 1929, you had the first kind of stock market, Wall Street people starting to get out of work. Then you have others start losing their jobs, and it just slowly spirals. Now some people, particularly in the rural areas, can kind of ignore this initially because they're like, oh, this is a city problem. They're finally getting their comeuppance for kind of neglecting us all this time. But the problem is the cities buy all the food and everyone's out of work. There's no one to buy all the products that these farmers are producing. So slowly even the farmers will get hit. But things are getting bad quickly. So after that initial slow grinding start, it takes off and then kind of goes off a cliff. So in 1929, the unemployment rate stood at 3.2%. By 1933, it was at 25%. That meant about 12.8 million people across the country were unemployed. So about 1 to 2 million people were homeless. U.S. Steel, just to give you an example of one company, in 1929, 225,000 full-time employees. 1932, zero. Everyone's on part-time work because there's just not a demand. No one's building. There's no demand for steel. People are struggling to cope with being laid off and not having work. They're having to turn to friends and family, to charity organizations, to their local governments. In Houston in 1932, half the streetlights were disconnected because the city simply could not afford to turn them all on. In Beaumont in 1934, they turned off all of its streetlights and they cut the funding for its schools nearly in half. So everybody is suffering. And the problem is things just keep getting worse. So state governments quickly ran out of funds and then they turned to the national government. And that was the big problem. Hoover wasn't doing much on the national level. And you see this kind of quiet desperation during the Great Depression. People are really hurting and they don't know what to do. They've done everything right for the most part in their life. They've worked hard, they've saved, and then when the Depression hits, those savings ran out very quickly or they were lost in the stock market. And this is going to leave people in a bad, bad way. But it's going to get worse, particularly in the Midwest. You have a environmental disaster hit the United States right as the Great Depression is getting real bad, called the Dust Bowl. Now, the Dust Bowl is kind of a two-part problem. So first, you had a drought, which no one could control. But the second was you had overplowed and over cultivated much of this land of the Great Plains. What had once been held together by grass on these massive Great Plains as grasslands had been plowed up and left bare. So when the rain stopped and the sun dried everything up, many of these areas just blew away in the wind. You have massive dust storms that carried dust all the way from Texas to Chicago, block out the sun. Overnight, you could have a decent looking farm or crop, and the next day, after a dust storm blew through, your crop is literally drowned under a wave of sand and dirt. This is going to force a lot of people from the Midwest to abandon their farms and go either east or further west to California and Washington looking for work. This is kind of the great migration of people leaving. About 1 million farmers are going to be displaced during this time as people went west looking for work and a place to live. Texas alone in its panhandle region lost about 200,000 farmers. However, it's the psychological trauma that's probably the worst for many of these people because they've worked hard. They want to work. They'll take any job you give them, but there's just no jobs to be had. And they're struggling, begging, trying to find a way to provide for themselves and their family, but there's just no hope. And this is the worst part of this, is that there's no hope. And Hoover doesn't really offer any help either. He told the people at one point, the government should not support the people. Federal aid weakens the sturdiness of our national character. So basically what he's telling everyone who's starving, who's watching their kids starve, oh, don't worry, hard times, they just build character. We're building America's character. Now, when you're dying, homeless, starving, you don't want to hear it's building character. You want food and shelter and warmth. So this is not great. Now it's going to get worse. Those bonuses we talked about in an earlier lecture that were promised to World War I veterans, well, Great Depression rolls around, and those veterans are like, we want our bonuses now. You promised them to us, why don't you just give them to us now so we can use them in our time of need? Instead, these bonus armies that marched to Washington, D.C. to make this request were assaulted by the police. And even the Army's chief of staff, Douglas MacArthur, used federal troops to drive them off. Many of these people who lost their houses were relegated to live in places called Hoovervilles, basically these shack and shanty towns. And this is about as deep and dark as you can get. And it's going to be into this darkness that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's younger cousin, will step and say, I have an answer. Herbert Hoover may not be willing to do anything. And I may not have the perfect answer, but by God, I'm going to try. I am going to at least make an effort. And he often talks of the forgotten man at the bottom of the social and economic pyramid. And he said, we're going to do bold and persistent experimentation. And he pledged, just like his cousin gave America the Square Deal, Franklin Roosevelt is promising America a new deal. He said that old deal is broken. It has failed us, so we need a new deal. And he's going to win in 1932 with more than 57% of the vote. In Texas, Roosevelt wins with 88%, partially because he chose John Nance Garner as his vice president. So this brought in a major state by choosing a Texan as his running mate, but it also brought Texas into his fold for Congress because some of the Texas senators were the most influential senators. So if you wanted all those new policies to pass, you needed Texas. Now, one of the first things Roosevelt does is start a bank holiday where he shuts down all the banks across the United States. He does this so that people would stop withdrawing their money from the banks and maybe stop the collapse of banks that was tanking the economy. Now, one of the most important things that Roosevelt will do is something he calls his fireside chats. This is where, for the first time, the US president goes on the radio and talks directly to the American people. And 60 million people stop and listen to him on the radio. And he just chats with them, tells them what they're trying to do, what the goal is, kind of gives them an idea that we don't have all the answers or all the solutions, but we're going to try all these things and find out which one works. And this is what people really wanted. They just wanted a glimmer of hope. So we're going to talk briefly about some of the major New Deal programs. We'll run through a list of them and talk about a few of them. So you have the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civilian Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the FDIC, Federal Reserve, Social Security, and SEC, Security Exchange Commission, Agricultural Adjustment Act, the National Recovery Administration. Now you can see there's acronyms for a lot of these after the names. Now this is why this time period of the New Deal gets called the alphabet soup, because there's all these acronyms, all these different programs they're trying to see which one works. So the FERA, or the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, is basically just giving cash to people. So FDR was like, we just got to get money in people's hands so they can buy food, pay for rent, all those kinds of things. Now, this was actually one of the least successful programs because Americans didn't want free money. They wanted a job so they can be independent. So this one had kind of moderate success. Civilian Conservation Corps was young men put to work, and they had to send a portion of their check every month back to their families. So this is kind of a hybrid military civilian organization where they kind of work them like a military unit, but they have to send money back to their families. You have the Civil Works Administration where they're building a lot of roads, campsites, stocking ponds, all this kinds of stuff. Now the biggest of all the programs is the Works Progress Administration. Now the WPA was the single biggest employer in the nation at its height, hiring 3 million people in the first year and 8.5 million at its height. So the WPA workers built over 650,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, and 8,000 parks. So you can thank the WPA for pretty much every library and post office in small Texas towns. You can see often they have these stamps on the ground. You can see them in Denton, you can see them in downtown Fort Worth, and they have these stamps and then that they built the sidewalks or certain buildings. You can see the legacy of the WPA. You have the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is going to be about building dams along the Tennessee River, hydroelectric dams to provide power to these rural areas for the first time. So it's jobs building and administering these new electric plants, but it's also bringing power to these rural areas. So it's improving life, but also providing work. You have several programs coming in to help people and provide security. So the FDIC is insurance for banks. So if the bank goes under, you're insured up to a certain amount. You have the Fed, the Federal Reserve, to kind of have a government safeguard of money. Kind of a bank, but not quite a bank as we understand them. You have Social Security, which is basically retirement, and SEC to kind of prevent kind of the stock market speculation that would happen that caused the crash. You have the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which tried to improve people's way of farming and also tried to facilitate kind of price fixing so that the price of agriculture didn't drop too low to make it unsustainable. So you have improved farming methods that they talked about, but you also have weird things like them dumping out milk. Now you would think during the Depression you would want to just give this milk to people, but overproduction of milk or free milk would drive the price of milk down. And what Roosevelt and the New Deal wanted to do was to prop up capitalism, not collapse it. So you have all these different programs trying to bring capitalism back, not let it continue to fall. You have the National Recovery Administration, which starts setting maximum hours of labor, rates of pay, working conditions, all these kinds of things. You kind of put the sign up in your restaurant and say, yes, we are contributing, we are working towards an end to this depression. And Roosevelt is trying to do this. Not everyone agrees with him, and you'll read in your book several of the people that opposed him. But he is trying. And while the New Deal and FDR do not end the Depression, they kind of stop it. They stop the worst aspects of it. And the economy does bounce back a little bit, at least enough to where people can get back to normal life to a degree. However, it won't be until World War II that we fully recover from the Great Depression. But we'll stop there for today. We'll pick up the new lecture next time.